بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. Last week we spoke about the end of World War I. World War I ended in the year 1918, and after this war ended, the results of this war was that the Arab world became colonized. The British and the French took over the Arab lands. The Khilafah Uthmaniyya was ripped apart. It was obliterated. And the Zionist Jewish influence upon the world became much stronger than before. And it was the European countries, Britain, France, Italy, and other European countries that were looking after the Jewish Zionists. They would give them an independent state after defeating the Ottomans. But of course the British, they betrayed those promises that they made to the Arabs. So after World War I, the Arabs were still demanding an independent state. And they were demanding that the Balfour Declaration should be immediately cancelled. And we talked about the Balfour Declaration. That was the declaration promising a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So of course this made the Arabs very upset. Palestine, it's an Arab land, and the Jews are being promised that they can use that land for themselves. So the Arabs demanded an immediate cancellation of the Balfour Declaration. And they also demanded that Jewish immigration into Palestine should immediately be stopped. And they demanded the liberation of all Arab lands from all foreign colonization. Like the British who are occupying Arab lands, they should leave. The French that are occupying Arab lands, they should leave. These were the demands of the Arabs. But it was just demands. They did not have any power to enforce these demands. And in actuality, it is the British and the French who were able to get what they wanted. The French occupied Syria and Lebanon, and Britain took control of Palestine. And they actually allowed the Jews to come into Palestine, and they allowed the Jews to establish a university in Jerusalem itself. In 1918, the Jews, with permission of the British, opened the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Right? So you can see the Jews are really getting a strong foothold in the land of Palestine with the permission of the British. So by this time, after World War I, the British, they controlled all of Palestine, and the British General Allenby, he made his famous statement that Palestine is for the Jews. This land is for the Jews. So after this great betrayal that the Arabs faced from the British and from the French, after the British and the French broke all of the promises that they had made, the Arabs decided to organize their own conference. So in the year 1919, the Arabs organized the first Palestine Arab Congress. It was called the Palestine Arab Congress, and that was held in the year 1919. So the Arabs, they met and they had a conference and they discussed the situation, and at the end of this Congress, they came to a number of resolutions. One of their resolutions was to reject the division of Asham, Greater Syria, which includes Syria, Lebanon, Palestine. It should all remain as one Arab state, and it should not be subdivided. This is one of the resolutions that they came to. The second resolution that they came to was that Palestine must be included in Sham. It's not going to be its own. It's not going to be its own independent state. Palestine is part of Asham. And we can look at separating Palestine from Sham, but only after the British leave Palestine and after the Jews are expelled from Palestine, then we can look at, making Palestine its own state. But for now, Palestine must be included in Sham, and that is all part of the unified Arab state. The third resolution they made is that Syria has to be an independent land for the Arabs, and the French have no right to it. The French have to leave Syria. And fourthly, and this is an interesting one, they said we must maintain friendly ties with Britain and its allies. We must consider them still to be our allies and our friends. Even after all of this betrayal, they're resolving that we will consider the British to be our allies. But this alliance should not be at the expense of Arab unity and independence. Arab unity and Arab independence, that takes precedence. But still, even with this, we want the British to still be on our side, and we want the British to still be our allies. So those were the resolutions that were decided by the Arabs in this Palestine Arab Congress that was held in the year 1919. Now, in this year also, the year 1919, the Palestine National Movement, so this was a nationalistic movement of Palestinians, they decided that they will not resort to armed conflict against the colonizers. These people who are colonizing our lands, we're not going to fight them back with military force. We will only demand our rights and our independence through diplomatic means, through political means. But we're not going to raise weapons against the colonizers. This is what they decided as well. So the Arabs, they had these meetings, they had these conferences, they made these resolutions, and they made these decisions. But in the end, Britain and France maintained their control. Then, in the same year, 1919, the victorious countries in World War I, the British and the Allied forces, they called for a peace conference. And one of the objectives of this peace conference was to decide exactly what to do to the new lands. Now that the World War was over, new lines needed to be made, right? The lines of the map would need to be changed after the war. So they decided to hold a conference. The Allied forces, Britain and France and Italy and the other Allied forces, they decided to hold this conference which they called the Peace Conference, right? These are the big warmongers, but they called their conference the Peace Conference. And this Peace Conference was held in Paris in the year 1919. Now, among the attendees of this Paris Peace Conference was Sharif Faisal ibn Hussein, the son of the Arab leader Sharif Hussein ibn Ali, right? Sharif Hussein ibn Ali was the leader of all of the Arabs. So his son was Sharif Faisal. So he attended this Paris Peace Conference, right? And why was he willing to sit at the negotiating table with the British and with the British allies, even after being betrayed time and time again by these same people? You have been betrayed by these people again and again and again. They broke all of the promises that they made to you, and now they're having their quote-unquote peace conference, and you're sitting with them at the table. Why were the Arabs willing to sit with the British even after all of this betrayal? And there are many reasons for this. One of the reasons is that even after all of this, the Arabs still considered the British to be their allies. And the reason why they considered the British to be their allies is because the British did assist them in getting liberation from the Ottoman Turks. The British helped the Arabs get liberation from the Ottoman Turks. So because of that, even with all of the betrayals, because the British did help the Arabs gain liberation from the Ottomans, the Arabs still considered the British to be their allies. So they still had some hope in Britain. Another reason why the Arabs were willing to sit at the table with the British is because they felt that they could not confront the British militarily. If they were to take arms and try to fight the British colonizers by force, they felt that they did not have the strength and the ability to do this, especially after World War I. Because after World War I, Britain emerged as one of the most powerful countries, if not the most powerful country in the world after World War I. So the Arabs did not think that they had the ability or the strength to fight against the British with force. So they decided, okay, if we can't fight them with force, then the only way that we can demand our rights is by sitting with them at the negotiating table. In addition to this, the Arabs, before this, the Arabs never had their own state. They didn't have their own state, and they were not accustomed to politics. They were not accustomed to the games and the deception that politics involves, right? So they really didn't have the mindset to navigate this situation effectively. So these are some of the reasons why they decided to negotiate with the British even after all of the treachery that they faced from the British. Now to add to this, within Palestine itself, inside Palestine, there was some intense rivalry going on, internal fighting going on in Palestine between the major powerful families of Palestine. There were some powerful families of Palestine, and they were fighting with each other. They had rivalries with each other, especially the Husayniyah family and the Nashashibi family. Right? These two families, they were both powerful families, and they were fighting for position within Palestine. And the British, they saw this. They saw, okay, these two families, they're not getting along. They're rival families. So the British, of course, what did the British do? They fueled the fire. They increased the rivalry between these two families to weaken the Palestinians from inside, to break the unity of the Palestinians. Right? This was the way of the British. So Sharif Faisal, with these reasons, he thought that the best option in this situation is the diplomatic option, and he thought that if I sit at the negotiating table with the British, then at least maybe I will come out with something. But if I refuse to even sit with them, then I'll probably come out with nothing at all, right? So he felt that that was his best option. And Sharif Faisal, because of these reasons, and because he wanted to hang on to at least some power, he wanted to get at least some crumbs from the British, right? He actually sent a message to one of the Zionist leaders, basically giving up Palestine. He was willing to relinquish Palestine as long as he could get at least some land, some Arab land, establish some Arab state. Okay, even if we can't get Palestine, he was willing to let that go. But he hoped that the British would give him at least something, right? Such to the extent that he sent a letter, Sharif Faisal Ibn Hussein, he sent a letter to one of the Zionist leaders, and in this letter he said, we Arabs, especially the educated ones amongst us, we look with great desire to the Zionist Renaissance, and we will do everything in our power to help the Jews, and we wish them a homeland in which they can live in peace and comfort. This is a Sharif Faisal Ibn Hussein saying this, making this statement, basically saying we Arabs, we support the Jews to have their own homeland. And the reason why he said this was because he felt that by appeasing the British in this way, the British would allow him to have some land that he could call his own. So look, the love of the throne and the love of the kingdom, it's a huge temptation that can lead a person to sell his soul, right? This is a very, very sad thing, right? And with this, an intense political movement began. In the United States of America, the President Woodrow Wilson, he set up a committee called the King Crane Commission. And the objective of this commission was to determine the best course of action for the people of the former Ottoman lands. See what they want, the people of those lands, what they want, and let's see if we can manage the situation in a way that will appease everyone to the best of our ability. So he set up this commission called the King Crane Commission with this objective, determining the best course of action for the people of the former Ottoman lands. So this commission, after investigating, it found that the people of Palestine were very, very strongly opposed to the Balfour Declaration. This declaration of the British basically promising the Jews Palestine as a homeland. The people of Palestine, of course, they were very, very strongly opposed to this declaration. And they were so angry that the British felt that they had the right to give land that was not theirs away to the Jews. The people of Palestine, the people of that land, they were so angry that things were almost ready to boil over. And the King Crane Commission, after investigating in Palestine and talking to the people in Palestine, they determined that Palestine would ignite. It would go into flames because of the anger of the people if the world continued to move in the direction of bringing Jews into Palestine and settling Jews in Palestine. That this is something that's eventually it's going to boil over, it's going to explode, this situation. So this is what the King Crane Commission, what their findings stated. All right. Then, in the next year, the year 1920, there was a local Palestinian festival that they used to celebrate on a yearly basis. It was called Mawsim al-Nabi Musa. It's a festival that the local people of Palestine, they used to celebrate. It was called Mawsim al-Nabi Musa, the Prophet Musa season, right? So they would have festivities during that time. So during this festival, in the year 1920, a great revolt took place. Things did boil over. Things boiled over. A great revolt took place with the Palestinian population attacking the British in Palestine, the British forces that were stationed in Palestine. The Palestinians attacked them, and the Palestinians attacked the Jews as well. And this revolt became known as the 1920 revolution because it took place in the year 1920. And another name that it is known by, it is known as the Prophet Musa season revolution because it happened during the festival Mawsim al-Nabi Musa. So it's also known as the Prophet Musa season revolution. So what was the cause of this revolt? What led to this revolt? This revolt was caused by Jews who began to provoke Arabs and Muslims in Palestine, and they began to boast that, look, now this land is ours, now Palestine is ours, right? So the Jews, they were provoking the Muslims, and of course the Muslims, they became angry, and because of this a fight broke out. So this revolt, it resulted in the killing of 5 Jews. 5 Jews were killed, and 211 Jews were injured. And of course, the British military got involved, and they crushed the revolt. And the British response, they killed 4 Arabs, and they wounded 24 Arabs. Right? So this was the 1920 revolt, or the Prophet Musa season revolt. Now, an important figure in Palestinian history who played a prominent role in this revolution was a very well-known Shaikh by the name of Shaikh Al-Hajj Amin Al-Husseini, rahmatullahi alayh. He later on became the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, right? So he was one of the leaders of this revolution. Now, after the revolution, the leaders of this revolt were sentenced by the British to 15 years in prison. Those who were involved in this revolt were sentenced to 15 years in prison. And the British military governor of Palestine, the military governor who was in charge of taking care of British interests in Palestine, he was dismissed. He was actually fired because he submitted a report to Britain stating that the reason for the revolt, what caused the revolt, was the Jewish provocation of the Arabs. The Jews, they started it by provoking the Arabs. So because this British governor, he wrote this in his report that the Jews are the cause of this revolt, they incited the Arabs. Because he wrote that, he was fired. Like, how can you blame the Jews for anything? You can't blame the Jews. Even if the Jews are the guilty ones, you can't blame the Jews, right? And this is still what's going on today, right? So this British military governor was dismissed because he actually wrote that in his report. So Shaykh Amin al-Husseini, was imprisoned after the revolt. But then he was released. He was quickly released by the British. And why is that? Because the British were afraid that by keeping such a prominent figure of the Muslims in jail, a well-respected Shaykh, keeping him in jail would actually cause more revolts. Right? So they thought, okay, we don't want to fuel the situation any more than it is already fueled. So they released Shaykh Amin al-Husseini. And later on, Shaykh Amin al-Husseini, rahmatullahi alayhi, he was made the official mufti of Jerusalem. Alright, so based upon these incidents, this boiling over that began to occur in Palestine, Britain and its allies held another conference to discuss this. And this conference was called the San Remo Conference. It was held in the year 1920 in Italy to discuss this situation. And when these allied forces, Britain and its allies, when they discussed the situation in Palestine, the situation between the Jews and the Arabs, instead of supporting the right of the local Palestinians, in this conference, the British and their allies, they reiterated their support of the Balfour Declaration. That yes, Palestine will be made into a homeland for the Jews. This is the resolution that they made in the San Remo conference. And they officially assigned Britain to be the mandate over Palestine. That the British officially have rule over Palestine. So after this, after the San Remo conference, Palestine was then transformed from military rule to British civilian rule. So at that time, before this, the British, they were controlling Palestine, but with military rule. But now, after the San Remo conference, it was converted to a British civil administration instead of military rule. And the British Minister of Interior, right, the Home Secretary of England, was a Jew, a man named Herbert Samuel. He was appointed as the first British High Commissioner over Palestine. So he basically became the British ruler of Palestine, right? He was previously the Minister of Interior in England, and now he was appointed as the British High Commissioner over Palestine, and he was a Jew himself. So imagine this, a British Jew in charge of Palestine. So what do you think he's going to do? He's going to look out for Jewish and Zionist interests. Right? And since he was a Jew and he was a Zionist, he immediately began implementing the Zionist project in Palestine. And he announced in 1920 official permission to open the sale of any land in Palestine to Jews. So the Jews were now allowed to buy any land that they wanted to buy in Palestine. And there were many very wealthy European Jews. So now they can just come into Palestine and they can buy whatever land they want to buy. And in addition to this, not only could they buy land, but any land in Palestine that was uninhabited, any empty land in Palestine, the Jews are allowed to just take that land for free and establish themselves and settle themselves on those lands, right? This is what Herbert Samuel decided, and these are the rules that he implemented. So the Zionist project moved forward at a very fast pace at the hands of this man, the British High Commissioner in Palestine, Herbert Samuel, the British Zionist Jew. Herbert Samuel also started issuing Palestinian stamps. The Palestinian stamps at that time, they were only in Arabic. They were only written in the Arabic language, right? Because Palestine is an Arab land, inhabited by Arabs, right? But now, Herbert Samuel, he changed the Palestinian stamps and seals to be written in Hebrew and also Arabic and also English, right? Why did he do this? Because he was trying to erode, trying to wipe away the Arab influence on the land. And in addition to this, the British government decided to allow for an increase of Jewish immigration into Palestine. They said 16,500 Jews are allowed to immigrate into Palestine per year, right? 16,500 every year. So this would cause a great increase in the proportion of Jews living in Palestine. Now, in response to all of this, all of these actions by the British, in response to all of this, the Mufti of Jerusalem, Shaikh Amin al-Husseini, he decided to take measures to strengthen the Islamic and the Arab situation, especially in Jerusalem, and especially in Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. He knew that, okay, if more Jews are going to be coming in, they consider Jerusalem to be holy as well. If they're going to be coming into Jerusalem, then they're going to be trying to take over some of the Muslim holy sites. He understood this. So he said, we need to strengthen our position, and we need to strengthen our claim on Al-Masjid al-Aqsa and the surrounding area. So Shaykh Amin al-Husseini, he started with the Buraq wall. The Buraq wall. This is one of the walls in the Masjid al-Aqsa compound. It's the western wall, right? We call it Ha'at al-Buraq, right? The Buraq wall. The Jews, they call this wall the Wailing Wall, right? The Wailing Wall, because they go to that wall and they make these movements and they cry, right? They call it the Wailing Wall. And it's considered by the Jews as one of their holiest sites, as they claim, right? So, Shaykh Amin al-Husseini, rahmatullahi alayh, he repaired the western wall and he paved the square around it to prove that this is part of Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. This wall, it is one of the walls that is part of Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, and it is a right for the Muslims and not a right for the Jews. So he repaired it, he paved around it, right, to establish that this is for the Muslims and it is not for the Jews. So the Jews, they were upset at this. The Jews were upset that the Muslims are claiming this wall. The Muslims had Jerusalem for so many years. They had Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, they had that wall, they had the whole city. And now Jews are starting to come in and they think that they can take over these things. So Shaykh Amin al-Husseini, he repaired the wall to make sure that it was known and it was established that this belongs to the Muslims. This is the right of the Muslims. It is not a right of the Jews. So the Jews, they were upset and they protested and they complained to the British governor of Jerusalem about the Mufti taking these measures without Jewish permission. He didn't ask permission from the Jews before repairing that wall. So look at the audacity of these Jews. They're fresh off the boat, new into Jerusalem, and they had this audacity that they can protest against the Muslims regarding their rights in Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. Look at the audacity of these Jews. These provocations continued between the Muslims and the Jews. And then in the year 1921, another major revolt took place in Jaffa. And it spread from Jaffa into northern Palestine. So the Muslims began to attack the Jews. They killed 47 Jews and they wounded 146 Jews because of these provocations. And the British, again, they crushed this revolution by force, killing 48 Muslims and wounding 73 more from the Muslims of Palestine. So this Jaffa revolt, it was crushed within just 1 week. Not by the Jews. The Jews didn't have the power to crush the revolt themselves, but by the British. It's the British who was crushing these revolts for the Jews. The Jews themselves, they were too insignificant. They had no power. They couldn't confront the Arabs and the Muslims on their own, but the British were the ones who were doing this for the Jews. So after these provocations and these revolts and, a number of these revolts being crushed by the British, the Palestinians decide, okay, instead of armed conflict, instead of revolt, let's again try to make some diplomatic political moves. Maybe that will be more effective. So the Palestinian political leadership, they formed a delegation and they sent this delegation to Winston Churchill. They sent it to Winston Churchill. Who was Winston Churchill at that time? He was the British colonial secretary, meaning he was the one who was in charge of lands that were colonized by Britain, right? He was the British colonial secretary. And later on, of course, Winston Churchill, he became the Prime Minister of Britain, right? He's very famous, very well known in history. But before he was Prime Minister, he was actually the British colonial secretary. So he oversaw all of the lands that were colonized by the British. So the Palestinian leadership sent a delegation to him, to Winston Churchill, to negotiate with him and try to convince him to cancel the Balfour Declaration. This Balfour Declaration that the British issued promising Jews a homeland in Palestine. The Palestinians tried to convince Winston Churchill, just cancel this, and these problems and these revolts and these issues will end, right? Allow the Arabs, allow the Palestinians to have their rightful land. But all of this diplomacy, it was in vain. Winston Churchill didn't care what the Muslims and what the Palestinians had to say. So all of these diplomatic efforts, if you notice, all of these diplomatic efforts in the past, and in reality, all of the diplomatic efforts, even in modern times, right? You are seeing the reality today. They don't have any effect. They don't have any effect. These diplomatic efforts that you see, even in modern times, it's nothing new. It's been going on for decades, but it never bears any fruits, right? Because these people, they are enemies of Islam, they're enemies of the Muslims, and they don't want peace. Rather, they just want to hold on to their own power, and they want to continue oppressing people, right? So look at the decades of diplomatic efforts, look at the results, and you will see throughout Palestinian history that all of the diplomatic efforts with these treacherous criminals turned out to be worthless. They were never effective, because the promises that these people make are worthless. Their promises have no value, they have no meaning, they have no covenants, and their word means nothing. Their word means nothing. لا يرقبون في مؤمن إلا ولا ذمة. Right? They neither respect the ties of kinship nor do they respect the ties of covenants. They don't care about keeping promises. This is nothing to them, right? In the year 1922, the Shaykh Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti, he established a supreme Islamic Sharia council. And this council became one of the most important fortresses for the national movement in Palestine, right? It was an important movement that connected the Palestinian struggle to Islam. That this is not just a Palestinian struggle, this is a Muslim struggle. Because the land of Palestine, it is holy land for all Muslims. It's not holy only for the Philistinis. It's not holy only for the Palestinians. The land of Palestine, it is holy for all Muslims all around the world, right? So it's not a national cause, rather it is an Islamic cause. And the Mufti Amin al-Husseini, he wanted the Muslims to understand that. So he established the Supreme Islamic Sharia Council. And it was led by people of the deen, it was led by scholars, it was led by ulama, by men of Islam, and it was headed by the Shaykh himself, Shaykh Amin al-Husseini rahmatullahi alayh. But despite all of these diplomatic movements and these political movements, despite all of this, in the year 1922, Winston Churchill, he issued what is known as the Churchill White Paper, also known as the British Policy in Palestine. And he presented this paper to the World Zionist Organization, and he got their approval that yes, we support this. And then he officially made the declaration in this white paper that Britain promises to uphold the Balfour Declaration. And Britain promises that Palestine will be established as a Jewish homeland. So look at Winston Churchill, right? Enemy to Islam and enemy to the Muslims. This is what he declared in 1922 in what is known as the Churchill White Paper. So the treachery continued. The war against Islam continued at the hands of these evil colonizers. So inshallah we'll stop there for today, and bi'idhnillah next week we will continue with the history of the Holy Land inshallah. Jazakumullahu khairan wa barakallahu feekum. Wallahu alam wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. If any of you brothers have a car downstairs, I'm closing the garage. If any of you brothers have a car downstairs, I'll be closing the garage in the basement. Barakallah feekum. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. كيف حالك يا أخوي? No, I have to announce this.